Welcome everybody to our session titled Confluencia, Arab American Students' Experiences in the Classroom. My name is Dr. Sosan Jaber and I'm here today with my friend, Dr. Nina Shomandajani. Currently, I am a teacher at East Leiden High School. I am a fellow and board member of Our Voice Academy, charged with amplifying voices of teachers of color. I am a founder of the Arab American Education Network and a founder and consultant at Education Unfiltered Consulting. I identify as a Palestinian American Muslim.
Hi everyone, how are you? I'm Dr. Nina Shomandajani. I'm currently an assistant dean at Marine Valley Community College in the southwest suburbs of Chicago. I also teach in the Middle Eastern Studies program at St. Xavier University in Chicago, and I sit on the board of the Arab American Studies Association. Along with Sausan, I'm also one of the founders of the Arab American Educators Network, and we're super excited to be here with you all today and really appreciate you tuning in to our presentation. So thank you for joining us.
So we have arranged our session around Rudine Bishop's Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors and set the goals accordingly. For the first part, Mirrors, we want to provide you with background information and debunking myths and stereotypes about Arab and Muslim students. For the second part, Windows, we want to present tips and resources to bring the Arab and Muslim narratives into your classroom at all levels. And for Sliding Glass Doors, we want to share some instructional modifications that support all students in developing an understanding and appreciation of stories and experiences that are different than their own. So among those doing the equity work, I think one of the patterns that we found and one of the things that really motivated us to put in for this session and to really amplify the voices of Arab American students is the idea that we attended so many equity sessions and rarely was the Arab and Muslim narrative one that was included in those sessions. And so this is a slide from a conference that I attended that was focused on equity. And the theme of the conference was equity. And the question that was asked before the slide was presented was, what are the voices or the intersections of people at the margins? And so they were defining who the people at the margins were. And as you can see in the slide, that Arabs and Muslims are missing from the slide, even though they are a directly targeted subgroup currently and have been for quite a long time. We are going to just give you a minute to read this quote from a student here at Glenbard High School who is talking about her experience in a school where equity work is being done. As you can see, Afra Hassan's quote shows that even in a school that's doing equity work and is very, very intentional about doing equity work, her voice is one that's often missed. And as such, in a school that considers itself to be very equitable and progressive in doing that work and including voices, her voice is excluded, and therefore she feels like her educational experience is very limited as a result of that. We're going to talk about providing mirrors and understanding the Arab and Muslim students beyond single-story stereotype narratives.
Before we get into the presentation, we thought that it would be very important for us to kind of set some foundational information out in order for our audience to understand who we are talking about. We use general terms like Arabs, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, but many people don't realize how diverse the Arab world is and how diverse the Arab American community living in the United States is. Arabs come from 22 different countries and they have a common language, which is Arabic, but there's many different dialects. There's also varied cultures and there are different minority groups that live within the region. Historically, this is a colonized area, and so their histories, their political governments, and the type of regimes that have existed in these countries for a very long time are all influenced by that historical colonized experience. It's also very important to note that while they share a language and the vast majority of the region is Muslim, there's also a very sizable Christian population. There's also Arabs that are Jewish. There's Arabs that may still adhere to indigenous traditions from prior to Islam in the region. And overall, it's just really important for us to understand the diversity. Also, another thing that these countries have in common is that they are also all members of the Arab League. The Arab League is an organization that unites Arabs in the Arab world. And it's also just very important for us to note that there are tens of millions of people, actually hundreds of millions of people living in this region, and we have to be very careful about generalizing. So who are Arab Americans? Arab Americans are descendants of the people that come from those 22 different countries that were just shown on the map. The census, which does not accurately count Arab Americans, unfortunately, has an underestimated number when reporting about the Arab American population. Since Arabs are considered white on the US Census, it's very hard to extract accurate information from the US Census data. However, the Arab American Institute conducts its own polls and surveys and has found that there's over 3.5 million Arab Americans living in the United States. My personal opinion is that this is still an underestimation. However, we do know that it's closer to 3.5 million than it is to 1.7 million as counted by the census. There's Arabs in all 50 states, although Arabs tend to live in urban centers. And as you can see here from the last statistic, that many Arab Americans are living within the Los Angeles area, New York, New Jersey area, here in Chicagoland, and in the Washington, D.C. area. And many people assume that all Arabs are Muslim, but actually the vast majority of Arab Americans living within the United States are Christian. And they've been here for over 100 years. Arab Americans started to immigrate to this country over 100 years ago. They have a historic presence in this country. They've contributed for decades and continue to contribute to this country. External influences that really play a role when we discuss Arab American and Muslim American identity are many. These are many themes that arise in literature and research about the Arab American and Muslim American experience. And it's something that we should take into account as educators specifically. When we talk about Arab American and Muslim students, we have to think about the external factors that affect their identity, that affect how students think about themselves, about how their self-esteem is affected by things like what's in the media, how Arabs and Muslims were treated post 9/11, historic anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment, the politics of foreign policy and the communities that live overseas. Many of our students have relatives that still live in these countries that are experiencing war, refugee crises, and many other situations that may affect them mentally, may affect their families as well. And these are just some things to consider if you have Arab and Muslim students in your classroom.
So we're gonna kind of start by also debunking some of the myths and highlighting some of the common misconceptions and clarifying them. The first is that Arabs come from countries where democracies are non-existent. And so speaking up becomes more of a challenge. And oftentimes I hear parents or teachers saying, the parents don't self-advocate. We don't know that there's a problem. And so that usually comes from the fact that speaking up against somebody who's the perceived power is considered very rare. Culturally and historically, the Arab culture is male dominated. That's definitely a myth. The Islamic faith nullified male domination and tradition, so it's not religious. It's more cultural and historical than it is religious, but just like all other countries, including here in America, the suffragist movement is very active in Middle Eastern countries, just like it is here, but it definitely isn't something religious, it's more cultural. Islam is a very peaceful religion, very contrary to the way it's relayed and portrayed in common media as one that really promotes violence. It warns believers not even to harm a tree if they can avoid it during times of war. So can we imagine another human being? Muslims in Arab countries have lived peacefully with non-Muslim neighbors for centuries prior to American and European colonization and political divisions. Islam really embraces people from all different kinds of backgrounds and does not promote living in silos and thinking that you are superior or better than people of other faiths and other cultures. Words like Allahu Akbar, which is oftentimes in the movies, especially associated with blowing things up, right, mean God is great. And jihad means a renewed interest to strive for something better. Those are not politically charged words, but they have been politicized by mainstream media. And so oftentimes these are words that are also used to bully students in many classrooms and throw things at them and scream Allahu Akbar in kind of making the implication that kids from Arab backgrounds are terrorists. The Islamic faith and pillars of American democracy overlap and complement each other. They don't contend or contradict with each other. And that's one that oftentimes is, people think that you have to choose either one or the other. You can't be an Arab or a Muslim and an American at the same time. But the reality is an American Muslim can embrace both intersections of their identity, and they can live very harmoniously with both of those identities.
It's really important that we discuss terminology. Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and Arabic are not synonyms. These are all terms that are sometimes used in media, pop culture, and in the movies interchangeably, but also that we hear our colleagues, friends, and community members also using interchangeably. It is possible that you may be Arab and Muslim, and you also might consider yourself Middle Eastern, and Arabic may be your native language or your second language. However, it's also possible to be Arab and Christian. You might be Middle Eastern and not Arab and not Muslim, and perhaps Arabic is not your native language. For example, you may be from Turkey or Iran, and you might be Muslim, but you would not be considered an Arab. You also wouldn't consider Arabic your native language. So it's really important that when using these terms that you don't make assumptions that all Arabs are Muslim, that all Muslims are Arab, that if you're Middle Eastern, that you are Muslim and Arab. And also it's very important to make that distinction that Arabic is a language and not a faith and not an ethnic group. So what are the implications of having no representation on the census? We had mentioned earlier that Arabs are considered white on the US Census, and therefore on paper or in the data, they don't have a separate category in order for us to extract accurate numbers of the population within the United States. Historically, Arabs have been considered many different things on the US Census, from Turkish to Syrian, non-white, Asian. And if you've studied the US Census, and you know that the race categories have changed over the years, and the use of the US Census racial categorization has changed through the years. Now, it's very detrimental for institutions such as educational institutions to not have accurate data, because our students are then invisible as we're looking for trends in terms of grades, in terms of graduation rates, where students need support services, and we'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation. So here's an example of a student speaking about whether or not institutions truly care about diversity. This quote is derived from a research study that I did on the racial identity construction of Arab American college students, and this student named Dina is referring to whether or not institutions truly care about diversity, and we'll give you a moment to read this. So here Dina is suggesting that even though many institutions promote diversity or say that they are promoting and encouraging a diverse atmosphere, one that's filled with equity and inclusion, Arab American students are not given the opportunity to identify on standardized tests or even on college applications. So that makes them feel as though they are being ignored or that they are invisible.
And so that brings us to the idea of erasure, the word which is covered by our pictures, but it's there. And the idea here is really to think about looking at the New World map, or maybe not so new. I remember as a student in school, when the teacher asked us to go and put a thumbtack on our home countries or our native countries, and I went to the map to look for my native country of Palestine, and it didn't exist on the map, and how horrific and like traumatic that was for me as a student to see that my map had been erased, or my country was erased off of the world map. And so it's really important to understand a few things from that. That there's an intentional erasure of certain countries and certain cultures in the Middle East, and having those stories kind of being absent and untold is definitely not accidental. It's definitely intentional. But a lot of these kids, especially Palestinian students, are students who really struggle more. The research shows that they struggle more than other Arab kids with bringing their pluralistic cultural and linguistic diversity into classrooms because of this intentional erasure, because they feel like there are such strong sentiments against being Palestinian here in America. So it's a dual battle of being Arabic and Palestinian, and that intersection makes it more complex. The other thing to really think about when talking about Palestinians and other countries in the Middle East is that although they're not necessarily firsthand dealing with the traumas of being in a war zone, they're living those experiences through their parents for a lot of them. And so these are kids that we would consider kids that we need to think about what strategies do I have to use to really address the students that come from trauma backgrounds, because a lot of them do come from those trauma backgrounds, especially if their parents came here from countries that have been in war zones for a very long time and follow the news and the things that are happening in their home countries very, very closely, and ensure that their kids are also following them.
So let's talk about the facts. Muslim American students are not bullied for reasons that other children are bullied, such as weight and popularity. Rather, they are bullied because of their ethnicity and religion, because they are believed to pose a threat to the American way of life. And the reference is here for that. And in this environment that our children have lived in, and that students have lived in the last 4 years specifically, and then also in the post 9/11 era in general, we know that bullying towards Arab and Muslim students has been on the increase. Just a couple of notes: the FBI's 2018 hate crime data showed that it was widely reported that hate crimes in K through 12 schools and colleges increased by about 25% over 2017. Also, anti-Muslim incidents numbered the fewest among the 5 categories reported by educators and those reported in the news. Most of the incidents reported came from educators, not parents or students. In addition, it's also important to note that Muslim American adolescents encounter much discrimination from teachers, school administrators, and classmates. We have a list of information here that you can refer to. The reason why we're adding this information, this data, is, Sausan and I, as educators, have experienced this and witnessed this ourselves. Many of you have as well, probably in your classrooms, but there is data that supports it. And so when we're asking for extra support for Arab and Muslim children, it's important to sometimes have that data when you're talking to administrators or even at parent meetings. And so you can utilize some of this data that we've provided for you here when discussing Arab American and Muslim American anti-Arab American and anti-Muslim American sentiment in the schools.
I'm going to move our pictures for this one just a little bit, because I felt like this was probably one of the most astounding statistics in some of the research that we did. And that is that almost 1/3 of students of color and students from other non-dominant groups are targets of bullying by educators. And I just want to sit on that for a moment and just think about that, because we're in a room full of educators. And to think about how sometimes intentionally or unintentionally, we are harming students who are in our classes and they're supposed to be in safe spaces. And if 1/3 of kids of color are facing bullying from their teachers, What kind of experience are these kids having when they're spending hours and hours of school time with teachers, and how are we defining their school experiences, and how do these definitions that happen in school impact their lives in general as college and career professionals, if even that, if they make it far enough based on their school experiences to have those experiences, how are those experiences post-school defined? And so in my study, in my dissertation study, I really focused on students, Arab American students, who on the outset, the district that I did my study on really thought that they were assimilated. They looked like they were doing fine. They were kids who were doing well in school, and they were active in extracurricular activities. So they seemed to be doing fine. So according to all the indicators of a checklist that says, are these kids feeling included and do they belong, those things would have been checked on a box. However, when talking to the kids and listening to their actual experiences, the opposite was what emerged. Students told stories of marginalization, and they were consistently bullied by teachers and students with regards to both race and religion. But even their stories that they shared, they could not name it as racism. They could name racism when it was something that was impacting other students from other backgrounds, but when they told stories about other students marginalizing them, throwing things at them, screaming Allahu Akbar constantly on the bus, and them going home in tears, they described those things as jokes from other kids and not necessarily racism. The parents felt that their children would never be accepted by the other. They felt that they could not advocate for their children out of fear of increasing the marginalization towards their children. So even though the parents were aware of these stories, that the kids would come home and say, this happened to me, my teacher said this, they didn't feel welcome enough or safe enough to bring those concerns to the attention of administration or school. And the teachers ranged in two categories. Either they were colorblind and said that they did not see color and did not differentiate between their students, or they were those who saw the marginalization but felt disempowered by administrators and parent pushback to address it. And so either way, I'm not sure which one is more damaging, the colorblind or the person who sees it and does nothing about it. But the reality was, at the end of all the data collection and following the students, that the actual belonging was very superficial. And so sometimes even when we see kids that seem to be fine, I think the reality is that they're leaving their culture and their religion at the front door, and what they're sharing with their peers and with their teachers for the most part are the things that will allow them to be as normal, and I say that with air quotes, as possible with the rest of their peers. And this is especially applicable to schools where Arab students are the minority and they're in a school that's historically been homogenous. And so they're the new demographic, and there's like a resentment towards the changing demographics, both from parents and teachers and administrators who are not willing to rock the boat with parents and address the needs of these specific kids. And so the question then becomes, if the parents aren't willing to advocate, the teachers and administrators are not willing to rock the boat and advocate, and the students are adolescents who really just want to fit, or they're adults who feel like their goal is to really finish school and not, they don't know where to begin in kind of changing and shifting the status quo, then who should carry the burden of correcting stereotypical views and misconceptions? And the reality is that's why we're having this session, because that responsibility falls on the teachers and the administrators in the building. It is our job to go out and find that information, not from the students. Maybe we include the voices of parents who are willing to support if we create those safe spaces, but it shouldn't be the responsibility of the student to educate the teacher. And I think oftentimes teachers feel like if I ask the student and the student gives me this information, then I'm doing a really good job about including that voice. However, almost all of the students in my study all vocalized the fact that they didn't appreciate when teachers put them on the spot and asked them questions, because they felt like it alienated them even more than they already felt alienated. And so the responsibility is attending workshops and reaching out to organizations and professionals and experts who can really help support making sure that, since there's so much stereotypical material out there on Arabs and Muslims, that your intention of really trying to include and be culturally responsive and culturally sustaining is not misguided by bringing in stereotypical versions of these students to themselves in the classroom, but is an actual representation. And obviously there's many representations, given that kids from different countries and different backgrounds and different homes will have varying experiences. But the last thing you want to do is bring in a stereotypical representation of these kids into the classroom for them. And so that brings us to the third and final part of our presentation, which is windows. And that is, how can we apply all of that background information and that understanding and really rethink the myths and how we can bring these critical conversations into the classroom to benefit Arab American students, but not just Arab American students, to benefit all students. Because obviously when we create classroom spaces and instructional activities that include the voices of Arab American students, you're also including the voices of other minoritized groups and other marginalized groups. And when we create those windows for students to really have the opportunity to like engage with experiences of other people, then that brings down the barriers that are created by single story stereotypes that are represented in the media. And so you're automatically dismantling those stereotypes by giving students the opportunity to learn and understand and appreciate from diverse voices in their classroom. And so with that, I think one of my favorite TED Talks, and if you haven't heard it, I really suggest that you go out and listen to that before you do anything else. And I've linked it to the top there, is The Danger of a Single Story. And with that, Adichie says, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And that's the story that we repeatedly listen to and hear over and over again. And then that becomes the only story that is representative of every child who looks a certain way or who has certain features. And so it's super important for us to really think about the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. And when we're doing that, the reflection piece is one of the most important things. And I think that on my own personal journey as an educator, and this is year 21, from the beginning of my education till now, I recall always not feeling like I was represented and not having a voice, whether it was in middle school or high school or college. And so, and I recall always being handed stereotypical novels and those novels having to be representative of me. And so one of the very first things that becoming a teacher I wanted to create for my class, for my students, is a safe space where they can find themselves. And I think that that was a journey that really took such a long time, but a big part of it was kind of stepping back and reflecting and asking myself questions like, how are we creating places for these students from diverse backgrounds? What happens when we immerse kids in stereotypical representations of themselves and that becomes the only story that they're privy to? What happens when we create stereotypical windows, not just for those students, but what happens to other students when what we teach them becomes the only source of information? And how are we directly contributing to inequity in our classrooms? How are we contributing to world inequity and American equity and community inequities when those are the things that are happening in our classrooms and when we're focusing only on specific voices, right? So we're always asking ourselves, not which voices are we including, but which voices are we missing? And I'm pretty sure that when we ask that question, and a lot of us think about it, many of us will find that the Arab and Muslim voices are often missing from literature classrooms, even from survey courses where world literature is the focus, the Arab and Muslim voices are missing. And if they are included, oftentimes it's to talk about 9/11 or something related to it. And so how are we actively working to get, by creating these spaces, how are we actively working to further polarize the American context in general? And we don't think of our role as teachers in the classroom as kind of political, where we're polarizing the country as a whole, but we have to really understand that the understandings that we kind of immerse kids in, and they become cyclical and things that they're only listening to over year after year, become understandings that they carry as people, and then understandings that they vote with and understandings that they act with as adults. And so in reality, if we're not disrupting systems of inequity in our classrooms, we become part of the problem of recreating them. And by emitting specific voices or teaching stereotypical perspectives, we are actively working towards recreating systems that have marginalized and polarized our country for hundreds of years. And so when we did a little question on Facebook, in a Facebook group, a creative teacher Facebook group, about what texts are taught as Arab text in culturally relevant classrooms. So when teachers are trying to be culturally relevant in high school classrooms, what texts do they often teach? And the #1 novel that came back was, or novels that came back were The Kite Runner and A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. which is considered to be the key text if you want to be culturally responsive. Persepolis was another, and God Dies by the Nile by Nawal Saadawi was the third. And there's problems with all of these novels, right? Because some of them are not Arabic, and so they're presented as Arabic texts, but they're not Arabic. They're not from Arabic writers. These texts are presented as Islamic, and they're single story cultural depictions that work hand in hand with Western ideologies, especially post 9/11 ideologies of what Islam is. In fact, The Kite Runner and The Thousand Splendid Suns made their debut right after 9/11. And so for a lot of people, it was exactly what they wanted to hear and know about Muslims. And they're taught in isolation. So if there's even an attempt to include the narrative, this becomes the only narrative that's taught. And so it becomes something that's representative of every Arab or Muslim that's in our classrooms and that exists in the world. And it becomes the only representation that kids have. And it works hand in hand oftentimes with what's on the news and in the media. And so that becomes a single story misrepresentation of Arabs and Muslims. And so what we've included here is, unfortunately, there's not a lot of text on Arab and Muslims from Arab writers and Muslim writers, but that's something that's growing. And so what we've included here is a kind of a list of initial texts that maybe you can start here with. But the idea too is that since there's not a lot of resources, empower your students to be content creators, especially in an English classroom, right? By viewing your students as assets and viewing their lived experiences as valid and important, you can create spaces where your students can create content, whether it's public service announcements or videos or poems or memoirs or short stories. And by sharing those with their other classmates, you're still creating mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors for your students, but they're creating the content, which sometimes can be even more powerful because that also goes with the idea of them counter storytelling to kind of take ownership of their narrative that's been taken away from them. And here are more sources. Nina, do you want to elaborate about these?
Sure, these are some links that you can access for your curriculum that will take you directly to pages that have lesson plans or videos that you can use in your classrooms. I also want to note that there's a link here that has original lessons from the Arab American California Ethnic Studies model that's being proposed currently right now in California. And there's many lessons on there that unfortunately haven't been adopted yet, but fortunately you can still use in your classroom. Also, if you're interested in looking at how media and Hollywood have historically portrayed Arabs and Muslims and debunking those myths and showing your students some videos and information about that, please check out Evelyn El-Sultani's website for that. And there's also some really great videos you can see on the Arab American Stories website. This is a quote by Professor Evelyn El-Sultani regarding the influences of stereotypes and the imagery that we consistently see. And we'll go ahead and let you read that. As was mentioned before, if there's a single story that our students are hearing over and over again, they're not hearing and seeing the pictures and stories of business owners, family members, teachers, classmates, artists, engineers, neighbors. If consistently they're seeing negative imagery on the news or on social media or in the movies that portrays Arabs and Muslims as terrorists, then that unfortunately is what's going to be embedded in their mind about their own faith or their own ethnic group. So it's really, really important that as educators, since we have this opportunity to bring in stories in the classroom, that when we bring those stories in, that we're not showing one single story, but that we are humanizing the Arab American experience and the Muslim American experience. And all of the resources that were provided to you on the previous pages gives you a chance to do that.
I love that, humanizing. Awesome. All right. So one of the things that you can also do is, since there is a shortage of like quality and like grade level materials that you can use, you can unteach what's on the media, right? The kids are immersed in that. And so one of the examples that we've used here is to really unpack stereotypical representations and use critical conversations to talk about what's wrong with these representations. And so one of the best examples is Disney. Just go to any Disney movie and you'll have tons to talk about. But with regards to our topic today, Disney's Aladdin is one that is inundated with stereotypical representations. And it begins with the light-skinned lead characters of Aladdin and Jasmine and their accents and their Anglo-American features. which are contrasted to all the other dark-skinned, swarthy, and villainous characters who are like the cruel palace guards or the greedy merchants that have very Arabic accents and very grotesque features. The opening song of the movie really characterizes the Arab world as alien, exotic, and barbaric, right? Oh, I come from a land, from a faraway place where the caravel camels roam. And it's a place where only camels and desert. If they don't like your face, whether they cut off your hair, if they don't like your face, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home. And so from the very beginning, the theme song of the movie is one that really demonizes the Arab and Muslim worlds, or the Arab world that is considered to be Muslim, since the two, for the most part, with many, are considered synonymous. It perpetuates the stereotype of the Arab world as a place of deserts and camels and arbitrary cruelty and barbarism. And so this is a great place to kind of show the movie and have the kids understand how at young ages, when we immerse kids in these kind of images and with these words and with these songs, how does that impact when they get older, how they see those people? It's the same conversation that could be had about Peter Pan with Native Americans or Mulan. There's so many different conversations that could be had with Disney movies. They're a great place to have, to do a lot of learning.
So trauma and impacts of 9/11. When we talk about educators as advocates, I think that it's really important for us to discuss how the trauma of 9/11 actually affects our children and affects our students. And I can tell you personally from my experience as a mom of 3 and 2 young children are still in elementary school, that the discussions that are happening on 9/11 with our children are unfortunately traumatizing to many Arab American Muslim students in the classroom. I've had my son come home and ask me if it was Muslims that killed everyone on 9/11 and why would Muslims do that, because that's not what he's been taught. We'd have to have a deep conversation about how things are being taught in the classroom, and that one narrative that Muslims killed everyone on 9/11 and that they're horrible people is not something that is really the impact that we want to discuss when we talk about 9/11, and it being portrayed as a Muslim crime. Now, there are ways that we can still commemorate and honor those that lost their lives on 9/11 during the horrific events that did happen on that date, without demonizing all Muslims, over 1 billion people in the world, and making our Arab American and Muslim students that are sitting in our classrooms feel othered. And so that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And there is a guide here, a PDF document that you can access that gives you some ideas on how you can counter those typical narratives about the 9/11 events.
And just to add to that too, I think that if you're going to teach 9/11 and teach it with fidelity, it's really important to kind of talk about how 9/11 has kind of created a pathway for a lot of things, including the Muslim ban, and really changed the political landscape for a lot of Arabs and Muslims on official levels here, with some of the things that took place officially after 9/11. And so it's really important to kind of talk about it both historically and currently. Really thinking about most of the students that we're teaching today weren't even alive for 9/11. They're kids that are learning about it as a historical event. And so as a historical event, kind of the implications of what took place afterwards are just as important as the event itself. And so, yeah, I forgot the sliding glass doors part. I said that was our last part, but it's not. For sliding glass doors, we're going to talk about specific instructional practices that empower students to enter, understand, and appreciate the world and experiences that are different than their own. It's really super important for teachers to understand that where there's a lot of talk, especially in English departments and English classrooms, about diversifying text and including voices that are marginalized, that are not often heard. But that's not enough. It really has to be coupled with instructional strategies that also allow students to engage with the text in meaningful ways. And like I always ask my students, it's not enough to know, but once you know, what are you going to do with what you know, right? And so give them, to build the spaces in our classrooms, to give them the opportunity to authentically engage and really think of things from a scholar activist perspective. And so it's so important that when we're teaching all children or teaching other children about all other children, we focus on so many different domains. But when we're talking about Arab kids specifically, since that's the topic of our presentation, we think about identity building, right? Because that's so important. And that is considering at the intersections of Arab and Muslim students, and Arab and Muslim females specifically pose various threats in our current context, right? And so identity building and helping the kids see that their identity is something that they should be proud of, and that they should be comfortably able to share with their peers, and not leave or assimilate at the school door or at the classroom door, is super important. When we think about developing their criticality, right? Considering that many of these kids are immersed in stereotypes of themselves, whether it's on the mainstream media or in some of our classrooms. Sometimes the only conversations about Arabs and Muslims is 9/11. And so what does that do to these kids that feel like they can't find themselves in history class or in English class or in any class for that matter? So really developing that criticality and allowing them to interrogate those realities and talk about them is super important. Developing intellectualism so that the students can kind of understand intellectually through multiple fields that pride and that the contributions of Arabs and Muslims across content areas, really is giving them an opportunity to be well versed in a variety of different things, and so that they can understand their world better and also understand their positionality and their framing of that world better as well, and that therefore they can navigate it better. Developing content skills, because the reality is we need those skills. We need those skills to be successful on standardized tests that really determine placement. We need those skills to eventually land a successful career or to be successful in college. Developing a critical consciousness is super important, right? And that comes from having to really understand that the world that they live in, so that when kids are immersed in racist reactions from peers or from teachers, they're able to name that and act on it, as opposed to giving excuses to their peers and their teachers and calling it something else. Developing self-advocacy skills. And I say this for all kids, but with Arab American students specifically, they do not come from democratic backgrounds. So oftentimes we wait for kids to come and report bullying, or we look at even the statistics that Nina shared earlier. We know that a lot of those statistics are not accurate because a lot of these kids are not talking about what's happening to them. And so that self-advocacy piece, if we don't hear about it, then it doesn't exist. And that's the kind of the framing of the problems that we're seeing in a lot of schools now. Because the kids aren't talking about it, because it's not being reported, because they're not on the census, then we can kind of act like there's not a problem there, and we go on and we move forward every single day like there isn't an issue, but there is, right? Developing those activism skills, considering that the research shows that they're perpetual foreigners. So how can this failed citizenship that Banks talks about of Arabs and Muslims having these strong ties to their Middle Eastern countries because they feel like they don't belong here and because they feel like they don't fit here, how can we work on that so that they can actively change that status quo and make sure that they have a strong stance and foundation here in America, and they can start to become actual citizens and not be perceived as perpetual foreigners by everybody else. Developing students' social and emotional capacities to talk about their histories fearlessly and with pride. And that's a really important piece because, like we said earlier, up until now, there isn't a lot out there. And so when we give students the power to talk about themselves, considering that many of them come from trauma-informed backgrounds, considering many of them feel like they don't belong, and if they do belong, they have to sacrifice something which is very sacred to them, like their culture or their religion, to feel like they belong, then giving them the power to talk about these things and to bring that to the classroom is creating both mirrors and windows for all the students in the classroom. And so one of the things that I've done in my school, which I'm super, super proud of, I teach in a primarily minority school. Almost 70% of our students come from a Latinx background, and there's a mix of other students as well. And so one of the things that I started last year is really shaping an equity conference that's focused for students. So we always talk about equity, and we focus our equity conversations on adults and on teachers. And the students are the receivers of the inequities. And so I felt like, just reflecting back on my own experiences, looking at my children today and kind of looking at their experiences and seeing how much more aggressive their experiences in schools, whether it's my high school student or my college student, or especially my middle school child, how much more aggressive their experiences have become in comparison to my own upbringing. I think it's so important for teachers to really have these critical conversations and open the doors for kids to be able to name things, whether they are the ones that are the receivers or they're the ones that are indirectly or unknowingly the people who are the givers of the inequity, right? So the conference is focused on understanding and appreciating the lived experiences of people, creating spaces for authentic conversations that highlight diverse voices, and building an immediate and direct bridge between knowing and acting on what we know. It's actually a full-fledged conference divided into 3 major parts. I've included a short video here that I think, just for the sake of time, we'll leave for you to kind of watch on your own time. It's a short 2-minute video that shows how the day was divided, how the planning went behind it, what speakers we had come in to kind of discuss things with the students. But in a really short explanation, the day was divided into 3 parts: learn, link, and lead. Learn was focused on students' positionality and their identity and kind of analyzing their positionality, how they view the world, how the world views them, and how that impacts how they act and react in the world. The second part was link, was voices of marginalized groups from a whole bunch of different backgrounds. So we had guest speakers come in from all different backgrounds. They told their stories. They met with the kids in small groups where they rotated. They had conversations with the students. And then the last part, we wanted to end in a hopeful note and not kind of immerse the kids in all of this really heavy conversation and leave them to kind of navigate that on their own, but to show them that activism has so many faces and give them the opportunity to see that they can be activists by singing, they can be activists by writing, they can be activists by creating movies or plays or in different ways of really just getting the message out there and creating awareness. But it's not enough to know, but they had to act on what they knew. And so we had artists from all different backgrounds come in and share their activist art with the students. And it was really hopeful and beautiful. And then the students got to use the rest of the week to really create their own activist art pieces in a voice that they felt comfortable sharing. And so I think the Day of Action was a really awesome conference, not just because of the conference itself, but I think it was something that was super powerful for the students as well as the participants who came in to talk to the kids. We all walked away from that feeling like we were rewarded somehow, because it was such a different experience watching kids who are able to kind of take in everything that we give them, take things to a whole other level, and watching the light go off and kind of watching them through the conversation, seeing them become empowered was very empowering. And so this is something I hope that we can expand on as a school and maybe open up to even other schools and share different perspectives of different students from different backgrounds with our kids in the future. So other things that I do in my classroom often are throughout the year, as we kind of break up the curriculum and we reframe. I teach American Lit this year, and so I've completely reframed it. Instead of teaching it from a historical perspective and following the writers of those historical periods, I've completely reframed it to really highlighting marginalized voices and talking about the history of how did we get here. And with that, throughout the units, the students create podcasts for students by students. They recreate TED Talks. TED Talk Tuesdays are a thing we do in class all the time. They listen to different authors and poets, and then they become authors and poets. They create public service announcements. They create commercials. They use the skills of rhetoric, speaking and listening, and all those really important skills that they need in order to build that content area as well, to channel it towards being activists and really counter storytelling. And so we immerse them in mentor texts for inspiration, and then give them a safe place to reflect on their thoughts and ideas privately through two-way journals. So they're journaling, even at a high school level, is something we do every single day. And it becomes a space for students to kind of come to terms with, grapple, ask questions. And it's a conversation that they and I have together throughout the year. Reflection time is built into the class, because whether you're an adult or a student, when you're dealing with critical conversations, reflection becomes one of the most key components. Giving them the space to have critical conversations beyond classroom walls through things like Flipgrid conversations, where we connect with other students in different parts of the country, or blogging, where they can blog and respond to each other, but really giving them the time to think about, immerse themselves in, and the safety of a community where these conversations are accepted and no question is considered to be stupid or too small or too big or whatever it is. So we talk about it all in the classroom.
So some examples of really easy classroom activities that focus on influences on your student's identity can come in the form of song, of writing a letter. They may write a poem or spoken word piece. They can also express themselves visually through visual art, maybe through a painting or through a sketch. We also want to make sure that we're staying up to date with the trends and give them the opportunity to create an Instagram post or perhaps a public service announcement through Instagram or even a TikTok video. And these are generally things that students find as exciting, as fun, and something that is worth their time. And it's not the typical homework assignment. So it's something that you can do in class or out of class and allow them to bring back in and share, or even to post for their classmates.
And so just really quickly, again, this is another video that's linked in there for you to watch later. This is one of the success stories, I think. This student here, Qamar, is one of the only students in a school of 750 students. She was one of the very few Arab Muslim students in the classroom. She was the only girl in the entire school that wore hijab. And Qamar just naturally has fair skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. And so before she covered her hair, everybody thought she was not Arabic. And then when she covered her hair, they realized that she was Muslim, and that really set her apart from everybody else. And so she, all her friends stopped talking to her, and she kind of became very introverted. And so we did public service announcements with the hopes of using the tools of persuasion to really identify a problem in our community or in our school and address it directly with our peers. She created this beautiful PSA, and I'll let you watch it when you have an opportunity to go back to the slides. But creating the PSA really helped her peers understand what her experiences were, and she became a leader in the classroom and a leader in the school, and was able to give speeches and have conversations with kids who were willing to listen to her once they understood her experience. And so it was such a powerful moment for us as a class, for her as a student, and for her as a learner and an activist, but for the whole school and the community as well, to listen to somebody whose voice had been muffled for a really long time because the space had been given for her to share her voice in a creative and unconventional way. So the idea here is that we're charging all teachers, all schools, all districts, everybody in the room, everybody who watches this presentation to start somewhere, right? Plant a seed. Begin somewhere in your classroom. If you can, find your co-collaborators and your allies, work with your institution as a whole.
And moving forward, these are suggestions for institutions. These are suggestions that I discuss in my dissertation research, but these are applicable to all institutions, not just to college level institutions. And these are things that we suggest that you bring to your administration as ways to address the inclusivity at your schools. So for example, offering more professional development training, revised demographic data collection. So although the federal government may not require you to collect detailed demographic data on your student population, it doesn't mean that you can't launch a survey of data collection about your students' backgrounds on your own and make it very clear that it's optional, but an opportunity for them to identify so that they can be better served. Also do more around student engagement and outreach in order to retain students and support them. We want to talk about high school dropout rates. What are the needs of our students, especially in this new COVID environment where students need to focus on sometimes raising funds to support their family through working jobs and sometimes missing class. What are some of the ideas that we can come up with for more student engagement and supporting our students in those type of situations? Also just recognizing that it's important that our staff and teachers also reflect the demographics of the students that we serve. I mean, when our students see someone that looks like them in the classroom, it's very encouraging. There are studies that show that students sometimes perform better when they see someone in a school that actually looks like them and resembles their community that they come from. It's also a form of inspiration and opportunity for mentorship. So how many Arab American or Muslim American teachers are there at your school in comparison to the demographics? And this goes for all different groups. If the majority of students at your school are African American or Latinx, how many of the teachers and administrators, counselors, and other folks that work at your organizations reflect those demographics? Also, as we've been discussing throughout the presentation, create an inclusive curriculum, and we've provided you with plenty of resources. Our resources are just suggestions. It's not comprehensive. There's dozens and dozens of great resources out there that we have not listed, but we suggested some of the ones that we have put in this slideshow just as a way to get you started.
All right, and that kind of brings us to the end. And although we'd love to listen to your questions, we hope that if you do have questions that you'll reach out to either Nina or myself. You have our Twitter handles. We hope that you follow us. We are part of this great Arab American Education Network, and oftentimes we do put out articles and podcasts and other things that we like to share on this topic and other topics as well. So we hope that you'll follow us on Twitter and that we hear from you soon. And if you have feedback for us or comments, please tweet at us. We would love to hear what you think. We would love to hear, what you took away from this. We hope that there's something here that you took away that you could bring back to your classroom and to your school when you get back to school as soon as this conference is over. And we would love to hear about it. We'd love to see pictures of it as well. We appreciate you being here today. And like I said, we hope you took something beneficial that will make your classroom a safer space for your students.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.